start. If I think we can start.
Yes.
So dear members, dear Africa Community of Practice members, dear members or those who are not members but they are interested in this and they have planned to join us for this Community of Practice webinar series. We are here with today and we welcome you to this webinar series, which is very timely with a theme on the use of natural capital accounts in policy scenario analysis. The Community of Practice family, together with the World Bank, will start by thanking our strong partners, institutions, more specifically the United Nations Program, UNEP, for taking time to work with the Community of Practice to organize this timely knowledge sharing webinar. We want to recognize and thank you, Monica and William, for the wonderful work that you're doing and the support that you're giving to the Community of Practice in technical and in all other diverse ways that you're supporting the Community of Practice. This webinar will play a role in raising the understanding within the Community of Practice of the techniques for the use of natural capital accounts, especially ecosystem accounts in scenario analysis, to inform policy decision-making, drawing on examples from our sister countries across Africa. The time is ripe for discussing and learning techniques to understand the scenario analysis models in developing natural capital accounts. This is in alignment with the ongoing UNSD global consultation on the complete draft revision of the system of environmental economic accounts for ecosystem accounting. We highly encourage our respective African Community of Practice member countries to commit time and to participate in these important global consultations aimed to develop an agreed statistical framework for ecosystem accounting, including agreed terminology, concepts, definitions, classifications for ecosystem assets and services in both physical and monetary terms using the accounting approach. We are very honored that we have our presenter today, Professor Andrea Bassi. He is the founder and CEO, Knowledge Edge, sir, and extraordinary associate professor of system dynamics modeling at Stellenbosch University. He will be presenting his work on the development of guidelines and experiences in the application of the modeling techniques with relevant examples from Africa. Professor Andrea has over 15 years of experience working with governments and international organizations on the development of customized models for the assessment of outcomes of policy and investment across social, economic, and environmental indicators. He also has specific expertise in green economy strategies, scenarios, climate mitigation and adaptation, industrial competitiveness, and more generally in the sustainable development area. Dear Professor Andrea, we are delighted to be with you here today. Thank you so much for taking time to make sure that you come to share your knowledge with us, all countries in Africa, through the Community of Practice platform. With this, dear members, allow me to thank you all for joining and getting interested in this important webinar, focusing on the use of natural capital accounting in policy scenario analysis. I am sure that the outcomes of this webinar discussion will advance our natural capital accounting knowledge and work within our respective countries to inform our plans and policies across the continent. Let us all be active, and I would like to request that we share all our knowledge and we also communicate questions and some of the areas where we think that we need more explanations, we can go to the chat and start discussions as the webinar continues. With that, I would like to thank you all, and I wish you a very good discussion. Now I will hand it to our moderator, Mr. William. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, for those remarks. Welcome, everyone. And before explaining the session, I'll pass to Monica Lopez, who will provide some welcoming remarks on behalf of UNEP. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. We are from, as Peter mentioned, the United Nations Environment Programme, and we are very pleased to be able to be part of this community of practice for natural capital accounting in Africa in particular. I wish we could be holding this meeting face-to-face like many others, but I get the feeling it'll have to be like this, and yeah, let's be patient with that. So thanks so much for joining. I acknowledge that it also helps for more people to be able to take part in these meetings because they're done virtually. So that's very good. Maybe I'd just like to mention that in United Nations Environment Programme and the Statistics Division, we are implementing a project together that's funded by the European Union Partnership Instrument with 5 partner countries, of which one is in Africa, which is South Africa. And the project is Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. We call it NCAVES. As part of that project, in October 2019, we held a regional training workshop on natural capital accounting. And that was one of the maybe first places where some of the discussion to the establishment or re-establishment of this community of practice took place. After that, it was in Uganda during the policy forum from the World Bank, where it actually became something more sturdy. And then in July, when it was officially established. So we are actually really proud to have been able to work together with everybody to make this community of practice happen. So just going back to our project, the Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, in which Andrea Bassi is also working with us. The main aim is to pilot ecosystem accounts as part of the system of environmental economic accounting. And not only do we want to pilot the development of those accounts in these 5 different countries, but we want to make sure and we want to explore how these accounts can inform decision-making and can inform policy. And one of the ways that the accounts will inform is by using scenarios and by being able to model those scenarios so that we can communicate the trends of the natural capital and how the natural resources are being used in the country and what their link is to socioeconomic criteria also. So I think one of the working areas from our project is the scenario, as I mentioned, and Andrea Bassi is responsible for developing the guidelines of that scenario work. So we are seeing how the experimental ecosystem accounts can help create scenarios, and we can then model them to be able to inform policy. And I think that's what I hope that's what we'll be talking about today. And I hope we can all learn from it and see whether it can be applied in our country. I'm aware that a colleague from Andrea was going to join us today, Josephine Musango, but I think she hasn't been able to because of other commitments. So I'm sorry about that, but I hope we'll be able to catch up with her another time. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities now that we have more and more webinars and more ways of reaching out to everyone. So I think with this, I'll hand back to Will. Thank you so much for everything and looking forward to a very good webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica. So I think we can get started, and I'll pass to Andrea in a moment. But as Monica said, unfortunately, Josephine Musango was not able to join at the last minute. But the positive impact for us is that will allow more time for an interactive discussion after Andrea's presentation. So Andrea will speak for around 30 to 35 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for discussion. So if you wish to provide your input, you can alert the moderator's attention in one of 2 ways, either by using the raise hand function. So next to your name in the participant list, you can right-click and raise your hand, or otherwise there is a chat box. So if you have questions that arise as Andrea is presenting, please feel free to raise those, and I'll synthesize those for the discussion that comes. Yeah, without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Andrea, and we look forward to your presentation. And colleagues, look forward to your questions and input thereafter. Over to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. Also, Peter and Monica for the nice introduction, for having me presenting in this webinar. So as discussed earlier, my presentation will be a bit of a mix in a way between the content of the guide and then the way in which the SEEA EEA, the accounts can be included in modeling exercises to perform policy analysis. So here is the outline of my intervention, of my presentation. We have different modules and different sections for the presentation. We start by setting the stage on the use of models and models for policymaking. Then we will look briefly at policy scenario analysis and forecasting, what has been done and why. Then there will be more of a deep dive into different types of models, scenarios, and how the accounts can improve both the breadth of the assessment, but also the way in which the analysis is performed. And then we'll go into specific examples of policy assessments that are done with simulation models that generate future scenarios. I will end with a final section on the steps to follow for creating your own assessment and possibly expanding the models that you use with the introduction of data that would come from the accounts. So as a starting point, setting the stage. Here is where we start talking about the objectives of the guide and the core content of the presentation today. So we know very well that there is an interdependent nature of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result, we need to take a systemic approach if you want to design policies that can deliver good performance across the 17 goals. But at the same time, we knew already before that if we want to develop policy that supports development planning at the country level, with a diversity of indicators of performance, social, economic, and environmental for each country, we also need to take a systemic approach. So certainly we want to avoid that we implement actions that generate benefits for one goal or one indicator, but create challenges for the other ones. So we know now that if we don't have a coordinated progress across the key indicators, we will not be able to maximize the effectiveness of the investments we put into place. So policymakers are confronted with new questions, and they need new and different sources of data, among which what is provided by the SEEA EEA, meaning that we want to use this data to shed light on the value of the environment and going beyond that, how these data can support policymaking to better understand the interconnections that exist between society, economy, and the environment. So this is the starting point for us, is understanding how to make use of these new sources of data that are generated to better understand how society, economy, and environment are interconnected, and how to build these into policy analysis so that better decisions can be made. Then the rationale for the guide and the presentation today is that normally if you look at ecosystem accounts, they're backward looking, meaning that they tell us the performance of the system up to today, or normally last year or 2 years ago, up to the point where data have been collected. So they help us understand why we got here and how. On the other hand, when we talk about policy making, we look forward, we look into the future. And so we want to find a way, and this is the challenge we want to solve, to make use of these data that are telling us how history has evolved for generating better scenarios going forward. And here is where we merge two different approaches. We have the data that we collect and we organized in the system of environmental and economic accounts. And then we have TEEB, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which gives us more information about how these data can be used to inform decision-making. So we are marrying these two processes together. Now, on to the first module, knowing what is the context and, in a way, the starting point for the analysis we're performing. Policy scenario analysis and forecasting is normally based on a few very clearly identified steps. What you see here is an image that highlights 5 steps. We normally start with agenda setting. This is where we identify if there is a problem or a specific goal for development. Then we move to the second step, that is policy formulation, where we identify what are the intervention options, policies, investment, targets that we could implement to solve the problem or realize the goal that we are set out to materialize or to achieve. Then the third step is decision making, where the decision is made as to what policy we want to use. And of course, this is based on forecast. This is based on both qualitative and quantitative assessments that we do with models. And after decision making, we move towards implementation, the fourth step, where we define roles and responsibilities, timeline for action and implementation of investments, to then end with the fifth step, which is evaluation. So we evaluate after having implemented the policy whether this has been successful or not. Now, either way, whether it's successful or not, we use that information to then restart the process and define the agenda for development again. So as you can see here, we have a circular process, and simulation models and forecasting can help and inform several of these steps, primarily agenda setting, policy formulation, and evaluation. And we have many different types of models we can use to support these processes. Now, when it comes to the specific contribution of SEEA EEA and TEEB, we have two main entry points to inform this process. The first one is a data push, meaning that we have the creation of new data, and with new data, we can improve the analysis, we can improve the understanding of how the system works. This is what the SEEA EEA offers. At the same time, we can use a policy pool. This is where, for instance, we have a request for a specific policy analysis that may come from a ministry, and that this policy analysis requires the use of the data that the SEEA EEA can generate. So in a way, we have two complementary approaches. The first one is we work to make the data available so that they can be used. And this is, for instance, what UNSD is doing. But at the same time, if there is a policy-driven request that requires the type of data the SEEA EEA provides, then we have that policy pool that makes so that we can embed this data directly into a policy process. So we have a synergy. We have both data being created, SEEA EEA and UNSD, and then we have policy analysis being requested, where we have TEEB and a more policy-oriented policy pool type of approach. Now, with these two, when we combine them, we can create stronger simulation models, we can generate more accurate forecasts, and then increase policy effectiveness. Why do we do that? Well, we have more standardized data, more validated and harmonized across different landscapes as well as countries and regions. And then at the same time, we know how to recognize the value of nature thanks to these accounts, how to demonstrate the value, and how to capture the value in policymaking. So you see, we have different entry points all moving towards the same ultimate goal, which is increasing policy effectiveness. Now, with this in mind, we have a variety of reports and assessments that tell us what are scenarios and forecasting methods, but they can be used in very different ways. So as you see here in the agenda setting side, in the top left corner, we have an example of exploratory scenarios. This is where we say, we are at this point in time, 2020. What would the future look like? So we tend and explore what are the consequences of action and inaction, and let the system run with these decisions to determine what the performance of certain indicators will be. But then when we move towards the design of policies, we tend to use more target-seeking scenarios, meaning that now that we know what is the target for development, now here we see a growing trend historically, and then we want to reach a lower level in the future. Think of, for instance, environmental degradation. Could be that we want to reduce water pollution, for instance, or globally we want to reduce emissions. So we do have a target defined by policymakers, and here we want to see with models, what is the best trajectory to get to that target? Should we invest a lot early on and make progress early in the process? Should we wait a couple of years until the cost of technology declines to then increase and scale up investments? So this is the type of scenarios we use for the design phase. Then on the other hand, we also have scenarios used for implementation, where we have a target that is defined, same as we discussed before, But at this stage, then we identify specific policies that we may want to implement to reach the target. So we're not using models to tell us what to do. We have defined through a policy process what are the intervention options we want to implement, let's say an incentive or a capital investment. And then we want to tell the model, run these investments, run these decisions, and generate as an output information about whether we get close or not to the target that we have set. So you see, it's a slightly different approach. The model doesn't tell us how to get there. The model tells us how far we go, given a specific intervention option that we have agreed upon and we want to implement. Then, last step, when we go to the review, which is the evaluation phase, we can use the models to look back. Now, in this case, we're not looking forward. You see, we start from current year, which is later in time, and we look backwards to assess what would have happened if we didn't have this policy, or what would have happened if we had a stronger or a weaker policy. So we can always look back and assess what would have been the performance of the economy or the environment or, say, employment creation if we had done something different. So you see, we are always talking about scenarios and forecasts, but they can be characterized in very different ways depending on which phase of the policy process we want to influence. Now, here in this next slide, you can see a few examples of the questions that can be asked. For instance, the first one is, what is the impact of introducing a payment for ecosystem services or an incentive for renewable energy? What type of scenario do you think this corresponds to? Is it for agenda setting, for design, for implementation, or for review? I'll give you a few seconds to think about this, and then I'll give you the answer. And of course, then we can look at the other cases to try and assign each of these specific policy questions to a type of scenario. So I'll give you a hint before I give you the answer. What we have in this question is mention of specific policies, a payment for ecosystem services or an incentive for renewable energy. So if you see the diagram here, we are mentioning specific policies, and so we are at the process of implementation. So we want the model to tell us if we introduce a payment for ecosystem services or if we introduce incentives for renewables, how far would that take us towards our goal? So this type of question corresponds to the implementation phase. Next one, how much does it cost to conserve 300 hectares of forest? Now here we have the objective. The objective is forest conservation and 300 hectares. And then we want the model to tell us, or the scenario analysis to tell us, what are the options we could implement to determine what is the cost and maybe minimize such cost. And in this case, we have a target, as you can see here in the design phase, and then the model can tell us, based on different intervention options, what would be the cost of each. So here it's design phase. Next one, what are the consequences of a continued increase in the use of chemical mineral fertilizers? Now here we are, again, looking forward, and we're trying to determine what happens if we have a case of inaction. So there is no target, there is no policy. If you look at the four options here, we start from current state, and then we explore what would be the consequences of inaction. So this is where we have informed agenda setting with scenarios. So we try to analyze whether there will be a problem emerging that will lead to the identification of targets, that will lead to the identification of policies. Now, last question, last example. How effective has been the introduction of efficient irrigation in the past 10 years? Now, this is a very different question. Now, again, we're not looking forward, we're looking backwards, we're looking at the last 10 years, and we want to do an assessment of the effectiveness of an intervention option implemented in the past. And so in this case, we are in the evaluation or review phase, where we have the policy, irrigation, and we want to see how effective that has been in the past. So as you can see, it is possible, based on a list of policy questions that we may receive from decision makers, to then identify what type of scenario approach we need, and therefore what type of models to use and how to set them up. Now, briefly, moving forward, how do we make use of this in the context of the SEEA EEA and TEEB for policy analysis? Well, first, we want to create new knowledge about ecosystems and the value that they provide. Then we want to create coherent and harmonized accounts because there is so much diversity in the information we are receiving that it's very difficult to use this information in a consistent way. We know very well that benefit transfers poses a lot of constraints and issues. So what if we had a fully standardized set of data that allows us to filter differences into locations and then use the values for new customized approaches? Then we want to promote the use of a systemic closed loop approach because society, economy, and the environment are interconnected. And so we want to make sure that the models we use, making use of this data, represent reality in a coherent way. Now, this may mean that if we take a closed loop type of approach, we have to either design new models or couple existing simulation models, because there are basically no models that can answer all questions, and there is no perfect model to begin with. So we have to figure out, and we can do that based on this guide, what is the best option for a given policy issue? Do we have models we can connect to one another, or are we better off by creating new models altogether? And then finally, we want to highlight how the use of simulations, again, either forward-looking or backward-looking, can help us improve policymaking. So all these steps are necessary to make the value of ecosystem services explicit and therefore using these values in decision-making. Now, having talked about models and scenarios, let's go a bit deeper into what models are available and how we can characterize them to provide a comparison of the pros and cons of different models. So first of all, we have to start by saying that we have a variety of models. We have many, but probably even too many models. And it's difficult to integrate knowledge across disciplines, which is why often we end up with too many models. We have several models for agriculture. We have several models for water demand and supply or water balance. We have several models for economic assessments and for energy. Since it's difficult to link agriculture with water, with energy, with infrastructure, we end up having a variety of different models that are somewhat thematic or with sectoral focus. Now, the SEEA EEA, when we develop the data to put into the accounts, forces us to think in a systemic way, and it adds an extra dimension, space. It helps us work with maps, with a spatially explicit approach, and this makes things, in a way, even more complicated. On the other hand, if we start looking at models using these key features, the sectors they cover could be different economic sectors, but also, say, water, energy, land, so different thematic areas. The economic actors, public, private, citizens, the dimensions of development, society, economy, and the environment, the treatment of time, whether the model generates a snapshot or a time series, a continuous time simulation, and space, whether location is important or whether the model is aggregated at the national level or at regional level, then we have a good way of identifying what models are useful for what purpose, and therefore how we can use them to inform policy analysis. So keep this in mind: sectors that are covered, economic actors, dimensions of development, time, and space are the key features of models to keep in mind for assessing how useful they can be to any policy decision. Now, I have here a couple of examples that I want to provide for the type of analysis that is found in the guide. Here, for instance, you see an overview of one qualitative tool, which is system maps or causal loop diagrams. They help us understand what are the key variables in the system, how they are connected to one another, and therefore they inform the development of models and policy assessments. Now, this is a tool I introduced because the guide covers both the qualitative assessments that help us frame the analysis and then the quantitative models that help us quantify trends into the future. Now, when it comes to the quantitative ones, we have covered more than 50 different models in the guide, and they're grouped into either thematic models, for instance, models that look at a single theme, economy, employment, energy, water, or land, and the models that are cutting across sectors. We call them integrated models. So the the nexus type of models. Food, energy, and water would be cross-sectoral or integrated models, for instance. Now, here again, I provide a few examples, actually two, one on land use models and then on macroeconomic models, to give an idea specifically of how SEEA EEA can support expanding, improving the models and making the analysis stronger. Now, assume that most of you are familiar with land use models. They're used for spatial planning, so there is a very clear policy focus. This spatial planning could be done for urbanization. It could be for deforestation or forest management. It could also be done for infrastructure planning, roads, for instance, power generation and transmission lines, and so on. Now, one of the challenges of these models is that normally they don't include the social and the economic dimensions explicitly. And if there are only land use models, they don't include so much ecosystem service assessments. So we have a few examples that we have looked at in the guide. We have the clue model, for instance, that shows how drivers of demand for land lead to land cover change, and now land cover change then leads to different outcomes, say performance, for instance, on water availability or water quality or carbon sequestration and so on and so forth. And what we see with these models, and I'm showing here a table that summarizes the information we have also in the guide, is that if we introduce SEEA EEA, we can create new and standardized data inputs. For instance, if the goal is to optimize land allocation based on the quality of biodiversity, the SEEA EEA accounts can provide information on biodiversity based on extent accounts, condition accounts, and then ecosystem service accounts. We can go even beyond that if we want to do an economic valuation of the ecosystem services, to do an economic optimization rather than an optimization based on habitat quality or species. So here we can see how the SEEA EEA can contribute to expanding the policy relevance or strengthening the policy relevance of land use models. Now, of course, having more data also helps us understanding the equations and improving the equations that are being used. If you have a full-time series of data, we can improve the validation of these models and adjust the equations as needed. Plus, of course, adding new indicators that otherwise may not be available. Now, a next type of models, a very different one, is macroeconomic models. And these are the models that are normally used to forecast GDP, for instance, at the country level, or employment creation. We do look in this case at two main models, computable general equilibrium models and econometric or macroeconometric models. And what I want to show in this case, instead of going deep into assessing how these models work, is, again, the contribution that SEEA EEA can provide to strengthening economic assessments. Now, in this case, we distinguish very clearly between the type of contributions that can be made by each of the SEEA EEA accounts, for instance, extent, condition, ecosystem services. And we look at how the information provided, in this case by the extent account, can be used to improve formulations in the model on production, for instance, the determination or how we can determine how GDP changes, and then also as a second step for how the impacts of production will change. For instance, we may be able to forecast based on the extent account the amount of land that is available for agriculture purposes and how land cover will change over time for agriculture choices, agriculture-related choices, what type of crops are being grown, what are the prices of the crops that are being grown, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we can look at the impacts of production in a CG model by assessing the extent to which the expansion of agriculture that is driving GDP higher is also leading to an increase in pollution, water pollution, and now that may affect human health. Now, if you're affecting human health, we may see a reduction in economic performance. So in a way, in this case, the extent account gives us the starting point, the initial information that we can use to then leverage the condition account and the ecosystem service accounts to then improve the mathematical formulations in the CGE or macroeconometric model and have a better, stronger, more comprehensive assessment of what drives economic growth at the country level or regional level. So this is the aim of the guide in a way, and the work we have been doing is to present what are the models that are being used for policy making or supporting a policy formulation and policy assessment, and then determine what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these models, and then finally determine how SEEA EEA data and the TIB process can help strengthen this model and generate an analysis that is more coherent and more realistic. Now, one assessment we also do as a result of these steps that I just mentioned is to assess how the results of these models would change if we were to use the SEEA EEA data as an input or to strengthen these models. For instance, as I mentioned before, if we were to include in CGE models the side effects of the expansion of agricultural production on human health, we know that GDP growth is likely to be lower than otherwise expected. Meaning that if we only look at the positive impact of expanding agricultural land, we would miss the negative impact on health. And so if we miss that impact, GDP will be forecasted to be higher. But then when we include the negative impact on health as a side effect, GDP growth will be lower. So this is the type of information that is useful to policymakers to understand how to interpret the results of a model. Again, models are never perfect, but we need to know their strengths and weaknesses so that we can better use the results of models for policymaking. Now, introducing SEEA EEA data is not always bringing good news. Like in this case, it will show that GDP growth may be less than expected, but at the same time, it increases the degree of realism and how faithful a model is to reality so that it can better inform decision-making. Now, again, for every model that you have indicated in the guide, and we have many different types, you find the same information. You find an overview of the method, you find the characteristics of the analysis performed, the potential contribution of SEEA EEA, and then a summary table like the one that I show here. In this case, we're looking at infrastructure model because we're also covering models that are used for energy supply, for buildings, roads, water supply, wastewater treatment, and natural infrastructure as well. So this is just to say that I'm providing a very, very brief overview in this webinar, but there is a lot more content that will come, and hopefully that will be useful to inform policy, but also to inform you if you're developing the accounts and using the accounts in knowing how many policy processes you can influence with your work. Now, moving ahead, having talked about models, as I said, the end goal of the analysis for us is to inform decision-making. So what are the types of policy assessments that we can do with simulation models and scenarios, and how can these policy assessments be improved by introducing SEEA EEA data? So first of all, the outcomes of the simulation are the end point of modeling. Myself as a modeler, when I run my scenarios and I generate results and I package them either in a cost-benefit analysis or in tables to be included in presentations and reports, I know that my work is almost done. I'm sort of reaching the end of my assignments. But at the same time, when it comes to my partners and clients, this is just a starting point for their own internal discussions. So what they start talking about next, once they see the results of scenario, is what can I do to realize the scenario I like the most? I can use investments. I can use incentives and disincentives to share the cost with the private sector or households. I can do other types of interventions. I can use land use planning, for instance. It doesn't cost anything, so it doesn't require investments and incentives in the first place. It's just about determining what shape development will take in the future. Otherwise, the government can determine to intervene through awareness raising programs. Again, no cost or little cost for the government, but generating awareness, the hope is that investments and interventions will be triggered by the private sector or citizens. Now, these are general groups of interventions that can be implemented across a variety of areas. Now, we look at, for instance, global priorities for planning. Climate change is one, biodiversity loss is a second one, air and water pollution, both important at rural and urban level, deforestation, land degradation, and desertification, again, these are some of the main issues that are also represented by the UN conventions. Now, in determining how important it is to use models to support these policy processes, we have analyzed a few case studies. Here you see a list of 7. In addition to this, we have 5 NCAVES country case studies. But I wanted to present 2 examples here, the one for Tanzania and the one for Rwanda, to give you a more practical idea of how models can be used and the potential contribution of SEEA EEA to the analysis. So let's start with the first one. So this is about the expansion of agricultural land with the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, SAGCOT, which is a program that some of you may know. It has been around for quite a while, discussed for more than 10 years. And this assessment that we are presenting here was carried out in 2015 or 16, if I remember correctly. So here, the underlying policy drive is the need to expand agricultural production to generate employment, generate revenues, and potentially provide more opportunities for the rural population, so not necessarily large businesses, but smaller activities, to thrive and improve livelihoods. Now, Andre, with this context, the type of modeling approach that was used was to combine different modeling efforts. There are 5 different models that were blended together in this case. We have, for instance, on the right side, a social, economic, and environmental framework, where we have an indication with a system dynamics model of what are the trends for population growth, land dynamics, production and profitability, and so on and so forth. Now, in this case, spatial maps were used as an input to calibrate the model, and then the model generates forecasts so that we can create new land cover maps for the years to come. So again, this is a situation where historical data were used to calibrate a model. So we use the data like the counts up to a certain point in time. Then the model generated forecasts, so forward-looking, which allowed us to create new land cover maps for the future. And these maps were then used to estimate ecosystem services. So the land cover map is the extent information. And then we use models, biophysical models, to determine condition and ecosystem services. With this information, which is spatially explicit, we were able to then feed back the results into the system dynamics model and again, make it more realistic or stronger and more comprehensive. Now, with this modeling approach, 2 main scenarios were simulated. A baseline scenario, which assumes a continuation of existing trends without the expansion of agricultural land. And the second scenario, which assumes an expansion following the full ambition of the SAGCOT program. We run, in this case, a couple of additional assumptions for the scenarios. One that includes investment in sustainable infrastructure, such as efficient irrigation, for instance, and one that doesn't. So we have a sort of a high cost and a low cost scenario. In terms of results, what this specific case study shows is that if we proceed with the expansion with the full ambition, but without investing in water efficiency or intensification of land and production, we run into a situation where we have water constraints that do not allow us to generate the level of revenue that the government expected. Now, here in this table at the bottom, we see the internal rate of return. So we carried out a project financing assessment to determine whether the investment will be profitable. And it is only profitable if you use flood irrigation. And you see it's negative if we use alternative interventions that have an extra investment in efficiency, for instance, or in capital investments. Basically, there's a high capex, high capital cost for intervention options. When we start introducing the externalities, so the impact on employment creation, improvement of carbon sequestration under a sustainable scenario, the fact that the water that is saved could be used for other purposes, either for expanding agriculture or for supporting population and biodiversity, then in that case, when we take this more systemic view, we make full use of the data that SEEA EEA can provide, then we see that from a societal point of view, the internal rate of return is positive. And it's even more positive than just using a conventional traditional approach with flood irrigation, which is cheaper. Now, why are these changes happening across the scenarios? Here we see part of the explanation. In this simulation, we see months for the analysis, and we see oscillations, and these are seasonal oscillations. We have no water stress, flat line at the bottom during the wet season, and we have peaks of water stress during the dry season. Now, these leads to a variety of outcomes. The first one is that the use of land becomes erratic. So land is taken care of properly during the wet season, but not so much during the dry season. And if you see here the red lines, immigration is important, meaning that all the laborers, all the work becomes seasonal in this scenario. If we instead invest in efficiency, you see the water stress in the blue line is lower. Immigration is not seasonal anymore, so we have workers that stay throughout the year in the fields, in the area. Population grows higher over time, so we have less of the social issue of people going back and forth and staying united with families. And at the same time, the total amount of land used for agriculture increases over time because less land is stranded because of lack of water. So the outcomes that I presented before on the economic side are driven by dynamics that are biophysical, water availability, and social because of immigration and the potential for income creation, which now happens year-round instead of happening for certain seasons. Now, the potential contribution of the SEEA EEA data to this case study are very, very clear. First of all, we were able to, or it's possible to expand the estimation of ecosystem condition, which is not only limited to crop production and water availability, it can go beyond that. Then, at the same time, if we expand the list of ecosystem services, we can improve model formulations, and at the same time, expand the cost-benefit analysis. As you have seen in the results, it looks like it's not economically viable to invest unless we take into account the societal impacts, so the economic valuation of the ecosystem services received. And so in this specific case, we see how introducing data from SEEA EEA can lead to a completely different policy message from not viable, these economic investments should not be done, to very viable, these investments should be implemented. So again, here in this table, as a summary, you can see for this specific case study, the potential contributions that SEEA EEA can provide for each account: extent, condition, ecosystem service supply and use, and then the monetary side of ecosystem service supplies and use, and then potential thematic accounts related to water. A second example, and I will go over this briefly, is the case of Rwanda. Now, instead of having, in this case, a sub-national policy ambition, in this specific example, the topic is national development planning. Now, the policy goal here is to restore forest land, 2 million hectares. And then this is part of a broader international movement to restore 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested landscapes into restoration. And here, a different type of model, a coupled integrated economic environmental model, IEEM, was used not as a way of merging different models. This is one new integrated model that was built for the purpose of assessing interconnections across development goals. Now, this model was enriched and expanded with a module on ecosystem services. So this is where the contribution again of the SEEA accounts comes into play. So that we had a macroeconomic integrated model that has the capability to consider the performance in relation to ecosystem services. Now, the way this model works, and I guess that you start seeing that these models are designed and customized to fit the policy question. But the main ways in which this model works is that there are specific inputs that have to be considered, inputs on the spatial side, land use and land cover classes. And then we have inputs on the policy side in terms of what level of expansion is envisaged for certain types of activities and what area is pre-designed for being conserved. Now, this gives us the, let's say, drivers in the model that will determine the extent to which land cover change is possible. And based on these changes in land cover, the estimation of economic performance and social indicators is taking place in the model. Now, in this case, the model is optimizing. And so you need to shock the system with inputs that are either policy or other types of inputs so that the model can recalculate what is the optimal setup and the actions that have to be taken to maximize wealth and performance. So here you see we have a variety of scenarios. We always have a baseline scenario, no action, business as usual trends. And then we have a variety of other scenarios that are from less environment friendly to more environment friendly towards the end. And on the end, we have two specific scenarios that are representing the combination of the interventions mentioned earlier. Without going into the details of the scenario definition, we can see what are the results. And the most interesting outcome here is that there are two scenarios that clearly come out as winners from an economic perspective. So if we were to maximize economic growth, investing in fertilizers would be a good option, a good intervention to implement. Now, on the other hand, if we take an ecosystem service perspective, other scenarios emerge as being the winners. For instance, the one with forest conservation. But we also see that the combination of the scenarios, the combi cases, perform quite well, both from an economic growth point of view and from an ecosystem service point of view. What is important in this case then is to identify what are the contributions that are being provided by each of the assumptions to the performance of the scenarios. For instance, in the forest conservation related scenarios, we reduce nutrient export. And so potentially when we have fertilization increased, there is an offset mechanism happening in the model. So on the one hand, you reduce nutrient export. On the other hand, you introduce more fertilizers. These two sort of level off if you look at the aggregate area, the study area. And so this allows us to better understand how each assumption within the scenario contributes to the final outcome that the model provides. I'm stressing this because it is to highlight that these type of scenario assessments are not only useful to tell a government what to do in terms of do this intervention as opposed to another, but also to determine what is the best package of interventions that allows us to get close to reaching all the goals that we have. So it's an exercise that is also about the selection and prioritization of interventions, not only saying A as opposed to B are the options to go for. Now, what are the contributions that SEEA EEA provides to this case study? Well, on the one hand, it couples a classical economic assessment, which does not include environmental performance, with ecosystem service-based models. And so it brings more realism, again, to the modeling assessment that is done. On the other hand, the number and the type of ecosystem services included in the assessment is fairly limited. So a further expansion of the accounts will bring even more value to the analysis that is performed, especially when it comes to ecosystem service valuation, because CG models, especially this one, in this specific case, only consider market prices. And so if there are no market prices for the goods that are produced, then these are not taken into account to estimate economic performance. But having more ecosystem services and related valuations would help strengthen the economic assessment. So again, as usual, we have this summary table that comprises the information that SEEA EEA can provide for each of the accounts. And then I would move to the last section of this presentation, being mindful of time, which is the last one on the steps to follow to create your own assessment. Now, we have seen a couple of examples. Of course, we could go over plenty more. If you have questions, I can share more examples. But underlying each of these cases and each of these processes, there are 5 steps. And these are very aligned with the policy-making process, as you will see. So normally, when we develop a model, we need to determine what is the research question, or what is the problem or the policy that we want to analyze. Then we move to the second step, which is conceptualization. So we need to understand how the problem comes about? What are the drivers of change that will allow us to realize a certain policy goal? So here we need to have a shared understanding of how the system works. And by system, it could be a sector, it could be a country, it depends on the study area. Once you have a good idea of how the system works, we move to the creation of the mathematical model or the selection of the model that could be useful for us. With introduction of data and parameterization, we can do model testing for the baseline scenario. And after that, we can run alternative scenarios and do policy formulation, policy assessment, and evaluate whether the simulations we run allow us to solve the problem. Now, as I said, the steps are pretty much the same, regardless of the type of model that you use. Here you see a bit more detail as to the activities to be performed for each step. For instance, when we identify the problem, we need to describe the problem statement very, very clearly, possibly in one single sentence. This is to make sure that everyone that works on this assessment, your collaborators, your stakeholders and peers, all have the same understanding of how the problem is defined. Then once this is done, we need to identify the indicators that allow us to measure the problem or the performance of the system and why it is problematic. Now, this is important because we need to make sure that if we have indicators that are being used to measure the problem, these indicators will have to be included in the models we use. So again, we develop models, in this case, based on the policy question we have. So practically, if you remember what I said at the beginning, so far we talked about the accounts, what type of data could be available to improve models. But then at the end, if we want to inform policy, we have to use more of the TEEB approach, a more policy-focused approach, where policy comes first. Based on the policy needs, we can select the indicators and the data, and therefore the model that we can use to analyze the problem or the policy that is requested. Then as next steps, we move to the conceptualization, where we determine causes and effects of the problem. And this helps us determine the boundaries of the model. How many indicators have to be included in the model to make sure that nothing important is being left behind and making the analysis as realistic, as I said before. Then we go on to choosing the model to use, third step, and then formulating and simulating scenarios, deciding what type of policy options would be used. And here we go back to the diagram I showed before when I said that there are many different types of scenarios. We can do exploratory scenarios, we can do target-based scenarios, we can run specific intervention options. So this is what it is important for you to know, the type of scenario that is requested so that you can then set up the model properly. And then finally, we review and interpret the results. Now I want to spend a few more words on the third step, which is the identification of the model boundaries, because this is crucial to the whole assessment that you may want to do with models and with the use of the SEEA EEA data. So here in this case, we say that first we need to review existing models, identify what features are critical to assess, and what are the features of the model that are required for the policy analysis we want to perform. So in this case, I have an example of a study that takes into account a few factors. You see we have GDP at the center of the diagram. This affects investment, economic activity and infrastructure, and this affects GDP further again. But then economic activity affects land cover, and so we have impacts on biodiversity, natural capital, and then natural capital affects economic activity. Now, this could be an analysis of a forested area where development planning is taking place, or it could be a national assessment. It is a diagram that links together society, economy, and the environment. Now, pay attention to the thematic areas that are present in this diagram. And these are presented in this next slide. We have the macroeconomy with GDP. We have sectoral production. We have infrastructure. We have ecosystem service valuation, which drives tourism activity, for instance. We have climate impacts, which have to do or have a consequence on water and hydrology. Land use is affected by the economy and has an impact on sediment retention, and so on and so forth. So if you just see how this system is conceptualized, and then what are the thematic areas we're touching upon, it becomes clear that we need a macro model, we need an energy model, possible energy demand and supply model, we need a land use model, We need models for ecosystem services, such as sediment retention and hydrology. And then we need models for infrastructure, which are affected positively and negatively by the dynamics that we have mentioned before. So this gives an idea that it is important in this case to carry out a systemic analysis. And for that, we need to either merge, link together different models, or create a brand new integrated model for the analysis of the location, landscape, region, or country we're interested in. Now, here you also see the contribution of the SEEA EEA data, for instance, for water, quantity and quality, for sediment retention, for climate, which can be used to determine climate vulnerability and resilience of infrastructure. And so there are a variety of different entry points for the use of SEEA EEA data to make the analysis more policy relevant or more, more adequate to answer the questions of policymakers. Now we'll move on to the conclusions now. And then I hope we'll have a good exchange for the next 25 minutes or so. So our conclusions are the following. If you're able to use the SEEA EEA that provides a standardized set of accounts, we are able to connect a top-down approach to data collection with a bottom-up approach to policy analysis. And so we are able to make use of strong synergies when it comes to using models for policy analysis. Now, we need to keep into account, and that is evident also from the SEEA EEA accounts on ecosystem services and evaluation, that customization is required to properly capture both social and environmental dynamics at the local level. Now, if we want to link the use of these data to the policy process, a customization is basically always required when it comes to the use of models. So here is another synergy. We don't have to modify models or the modeling approach too much if we make use of SEEA EEA data. But in fact, we have another way of customizing the approach, which is what policymakers need if we use SEEA EEA data. So there is a strong synergy in the process, top-down and bottom-up, but there is also a strong synergy in the customization and use of models by providing that customization that is brought about by the use of environmental data. Then, if we are able to combine this work and make it policy relevant, we are able to also bridge another gap, which is the need to look at history to be able to better forecast the future. And this also allows us to create a link or a bridge between science and policy. Why am I saying this? Because in many cases, models start from the latest available data point, if say 2018 or 2017, depending on what is the latest data point we have. But if we use SEEA EEA and we have data, historical data that help us understand the reasons for change, we are certainly going to strengthen the way the models are built to make stronger forecasts. And that is very, very important. Now, that validated, harmonized set of data is important to be able to generate this type of improvement for models. So finally, we say that using SEEA EEA and TEEB can contribute to the development and refinement of models and related policy assessments. So in this case, we're not saying that we need to change the way we do modeling work for policy analysis. We are simply indicating that we can continue using the models we've been using so far. In certain instances, when the policy assessment requires it, we can link models, so we can create an integrated model. But the bottom line is that just about any model that we're currently using can benefit from the availability of the SEEA EEA data and the TEEB process to policy analysis. Now, what is critical in this case is that this modeling work and process is implemented using a systemic approach and involving a broader group of local stakeholders. And this is important because we are advocating for linking different themes and types of data together, for which we need a broader range of expertise. And so working in isolation just doesn't help the process in this case. So hopefully the joint use of SEEA EEA and TEEB can actually help bring in different experts together to improve the way in which policy formulation and policy evaluation are carried out, and therefore having a stronger impact on policy effectiveness. So thank you for bearing with me throughout this presentation, and I look forward to exchanging more if you have any questions. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much for the rich and informative presentation. It's very much appreciated. We already have some messages of gratitude coming in on the chat, so it has been well received. Colleagues, we have around 25 minutes, I would suggest, for a discussion. So if you would like to raise a question or to share your experience, either use the chat function or raise your hand. Or if you're unable to get our attention otherwise, you can use the WhatsApp or turn your video on and wave, and we will try to answer all the questions. Let me begin with, I'll start with 3 that have been raised on the chat, and then proceed to the others. So there are a couple of questions on data specifically, Andrea, the uses of which kind of data are used. So Milo Chutcha from Democratic Republic of Congo asks what the source of data can be used in models or scenarios. Specifically, can we use data available from state departments or universities to build a model, or do we need to collect primary data? Nelson Jallar asks whether the module is applicable to all the project in collecting data. I tried to clarify that question, but I think Nelson is offline. But I think in general, I think, Andrea, if you could just provide some observations on different kinds of data, and particularly, I guess, in situations where data are not really readily available, how we can use some of these techniques. The second question is on the assumptions. So what are some of the major assumptions in general used in the models, and how can we calculate a level of confidence? So I think here a question on how assumptions are factored into the models and how you present the results to reflect the dependence of the results on particular assumptions. And finally, a question on policy uptake and how we can get policymakers to trust. This is a question from Everest Rutebuka on the level of trust that policymakers will place in the results. How can we validate the models to reality? And in particular, given we might be projecting sort of 10, 20 years in the future, how can we convince policymakers that our models and the results are robust to changes over time? So maybe I'll stop with those 3 and then come back for some more. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you. These are very, very good questions. I'll try and be brief so that we can take more in the next few minutes. So first of all, what type of data are used? For instance, primary versus secondary data. A lot of that depends on the type of model that you want to use. Now, in my presentation, we didn't go into any specific modeling exercise. I presented a variety of options. And so as you can imagine, each model needs its own data. But in general, I would say that when it comes to macroeconomic analysis, when it comes to energy, for instance, infrastructure investments, secondary data are more than enough. Now, in this case, we have specific databases, such as the energy balance at the country level or local level. We have, in some cases, a greenhouse gas inventory or a similar framework for the assessment of emissions from different sources. Could be agriculture and managed soils, or LULUCF, or energy. So these are normally more than enough to develop models. Primary data are normally needed to capture the location-specific dynamics. And so this has to do with social indicators, where we often use household surveys, as well as when it comes to estimating the provisioning of ecosystem services, where measurements and peer-reviewed research at universities, so academic type of assessments, are always very useful. And that is because there is often, and hence a reason for having the SEEA EEA, there is very often the lack of spatially explicit data at national level based on measurement. In the vast majority of cases, spatially explicit data are based on model parameters, not on actual observations. So again, depending on the type of dynamics, we have a lot of reliance on secondary data, but when it comes to social and environmental dynamics, very often we go to primary or specific studies that are for specific locations. Now, what to do when there are data gaps? I think that was another important question. It very much depends on the type of model you use. So there are models that are causal descriptive, meaning that they try and represent the reason why change is happening in the system. Now, in that case, if you have data gaps, for instance, incomplete time series, the model and the outcomes are not going to be affected extensively. But if you use an econometric model that generates forecasts based on the quantity and quality of data you have from the past, then you're going to see changes in the confidence or the quality of the forecasts. Same with optimization models. If you lack data for one of the parameters that needs to be optimized, then the results are likely to be suboptimal, let's say, or not as valid as they could be. So again, it really depends on the type of model, but what we often do to counter the lack of data or the challenges is to carry out sensitivity analysis. So this means that instead of running one single scenario, we run 10, 20, maybe 100 or even 1,000 simulations, depending on the topic and the parameter to test, where we tell the model, run 1,000 simulations using any value you want to pick between, let's say, 2 and 10. We determine the distribution, the probability distribution that the model should take, and the model will give us as a result the probability to obtain a certain output for a certain variable, given the input that was chosen. As an example, we could say, we don't know how precipitation would change. The model will pick values between 0 millimeters and 10 millimeters. And the output it will give us is the amount of land productivity or yield that would result from the choice that was made as an input. So sensitivity analysis gives us an idea of the range of outcomes given an uncertain input. And the same can be done for assumptions. If we have initial assumptions we're not sure about, and that happens often when we are connecting different models with different thematic areas of focus, then we may need to make assumptions about the strength of some relationships. For instance, the extent to which, say, economic activity or a price for a specific crop determines the land cover change the following year to expand production of that specific crop. Then again, we do sensitivity analysis and run several simulations to determine what the range of outcomes may be. Now, this reduces the uncertainty and risk for decision makers because they don't have to trust one single number, but they see a range of possible outcomes. Now, when it comes to policy uptake, the other question, in my experience, and I've been working in this field for about 20 years now, to me, the most important factor to generate buy-in from policymakers is that the models have to reflect reality. In a way, when I talk to a decision maker, it could be a technical staff of the ministry, it could be a minister himself, or a committee from a national planning unit, for instance. They already have in mind, much better than I do, what are the factors that drive change in their own country or in their own sector. So if they see that the model represents a theory that is not aligned with their understanding, it would be difficult for them to trust them. But if the model is realistic, and so in this case, as we said before, if we include environmental impacts, if we include social impacts, if we include the consequences of water pollution on human health, they will start thinking, I'm aware of that dynamic. I remember that happened 3 years ago. And so this is a process that helps creating more ownership for the model and the analysis. Beyond this, also my experience is that if you start designing the model with local stakeholders, if you identify the policy issues, if you identify the boundaries of the model, we develop a causal map with a local team of stakeholders. If they're involved from day one, they will be better placed to understand the outcomes of the simulations, and it's more likely they will trust such outcomes. And so keeping people involved throughout the modeling process is also very, very important for policy uptake in the end. I'll stop here. Do you have more questions?
Yeah, we do, Andrea. Thanks for those answers. So there's quite a lot coming in, so I'll try and do justice to this. So Everest is asking about the the integration of social and political dynamics and changes into the models. So thinking about, well, examples such as a global pandemic, or I guess country political insecurity, how those factors can be included into the modeling. Well, I think you may have covered this question, but she's specifically asking about instances where there's a lack of baseline data on land use, land cover. So how that could be tackled if you're, in particular in the agricultural context, how we can sort of make a start even without that baseline data. A question from Sylvia in FAO about who are the stakeholders for these models, and I guess very much depends on the particular analysis being undertaken. But she's also asking if they can be applied at the subnational level. The cases you had were more national, but maybe some examples from a subnational level would be helpful. And then finally, before I pause and let you answer those, Shaima asks specifically which are the best models for analysis of ecosystem resources and to estimate the degradation cost of it. So how would you go about modeling the cost of ecosystem degradation? Over to you.
Great, thank you. Very, very interesting questions. Again, I'll be brief in the expectation that more and equally interesting questions will come later. So on the first one, how to include social and political dynamics. Again, it depends on the model. In some cases, these have to be external assumptions. And so we have to assume as an input to the model, as a shock, that there will be an economic downturn. And in this case, we could use forecasts from the World Bank, the IMF, the Ministry of Finance at the country level, or say the Prime Minister's office, and then see how the model reacts to the introduction of such shocks. On the other hand, for other models that are more integrated, thinking about system dynamics models and maybe CGE models to a certain extent, economic performance or social change may be an output of the model. So we need to introduce different types of inputs. For instance, in system dynamics models I've developed, including for Ethiopia, for instance, at the moment, we introduced a number of waves from COVID-19, from the pandemic that are expected. That gives us the extent to which there will be a shutdown of economic activities, the extent to which there will be a negative impact on trade for import and export. And that determines, as a result, the GDP growth that will then be used to assess changes in energy consumption, in land use, and so on and so forth. So it really depends on what is sort of the scope of the model and the boundaries of the model. Now, one thing that I've done and in determining how these changes can affect policy performance is in the case of Indonesia, for instance, the government last year or earlier this year has approved a green economy plan. The medium-term development plan is a green economy plan. Now, the assumption that was made in the past few months is that as long as there is a state of emergency, as long as there is the pandemic, then investments in environmental conservation will be halted, will stop. So that is an assumption that was made with the Ministry of Planning and Department of the Environment already 3-4 months ago. It turns out that, being one of the many scenarios we looked at, the government, in fact, decided to freeze expenditure in these areas to reallocate resources to a different policy package that strengthens economic growth and generates more of a V-shaped rebound for the economy. So again, this is an example of how this information can be built into the model. And in this specific case, it is to determine the effectiveness of policies, which declines because of competing priorities. Now, next question was what to do when there is lack of data on land use. So I normally use two approaches. The first one is to consider what are the drivers of land use or land cover change. I start high level. I start with population, for instance. I look at economic dynamics at the country level, whether there is a trade for specific commodities. Now, understanding how these change give us insights for how land cover may change. Then certainly we can look at databases. For instance, the European Space Agency provides land cover maps for 2015 for the whole world. So we can have an anchor if we don't have national data as to what was in that specific year land cover and the use of land. Now, of course, there are challenges, meaning that very often we don't have a lot of detail, for instance, on the crops that are grown on agricultural land. So for that purpose, if you need that level of detail, there are models that attempt at optimizing the type of crops that can be grown based on characteristics of the soil, topography, and water availability. So even if you don't have specific maps as a starting point, we can use other sources, we can analyze the underlying drivers of change, and then we can use models to optimize land allocation. Now, this being said, an extra complication that emerges is that very often there is a big difference between the actual land cover and the actual use and the legal state of land. So often we find maps that show the legal state of land, where let's say we would have a forested area, but in practice, that forested area is being converted to agriculture or is converted to forest plantation. So as you go deeper, there are challenges, different challenges to be faced, but there are options from different models and databases to counter some of these challenges. Next question was about the stakeholders. These are normally defined early in the process. As we develop a system map and identify the boundaries of the model that we want to use, the indicators we include in that map will help us identify the right stakeholders. Pretty much anyone that is impacted directly, indirectly, or an induced way by the policies and investments we introduce should be involved in the discussion of scenarios and the assessment of the outcomes. So when I work with integrated models, we normally have multi-stakeholder meetings with 30 to 50 participants representing government, academia, civil society, and businesses, for instance. And so they all come together at the beginning of the project, as a first meeting. Then we may reach out to them bilaterally to help us with data collection and model validation. And then we bring everyone back together when we're ready to run the simulations to analyze the results together. And so this is an open process that brings a variety of people involved throughout the modeling exercise. Receiving results at the end of the process is never very helpful because it creates all sorts of challenges and misaligned expectations. So I would strongly encourage you to keep people involved throughout the process. Then the last question is the most difficult one. I don't have an answer really for what are the best models for looking at ecosystems and degradation and valuing that. Every model has strengths and weaknesses. Every model is designed for a purpose. So it's very difficult to tell what is the best model. I can tell you that some of the models I've been using is the INVEST model developed by the Natural Capital Project with Stanford, WWF, University of Minnesota. But this, in my view, is a very flexible, very simple model that gives us sort of a first generalized view of the system and ecosystem services. It's not the most detailed model you can use, but at the same time, the more detailed models require more time, more resources, more data inputs. So again, there is no best model. There is just the model that fits your purpose better than others. And it's, without knowing the specifics of the topic and the study, it's impossible to tell what would be the best model. Okay, over to you, Will.
Thanks, Andrea. You're doing a remarkable job of answering these questions, I must say. So thank you very much. Maybe just to flag, colleague Dimeo, I think from Botswana, asked a question about the collaborative opportunities for ensuring that the results of studies are taken in policy making. But I think that you sort of covered that in your last answer. But Dimeo, if there's anything else you wish to ask, please add that to the chat. There's a couple of requests. Of course, the slides and the recordings will be shared, but specifically the case studies on Tanzania and Rwanda, whether they can be shared. I think what we could do, Andrea, is add to your slide deck links to publicly available resources on a lot of these, on the examples you presented and also many others. There's a great question from Gerard, because it enables us to advertise. So the question is whether it's possible to organize an e-learning. So yes, I mean, this presentation that Andrea has given is just a preview of the more extensive guidelines that will be published later or sorry, rather early next year, and that will be translated into an e-learning platform. I know many of you have done the e-learning training on the SEEA central frameworks, so a similar training will be developed. Let me see if I've missed any. Sophia from the World Bank is asking, would be interesting if you could share your experience in working with policymakers. Who have you worked with, and maybe you can focus on difficulties that you've encountered, and what, how you've overcome those. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. I will provide very, very brief inputs to the first questions, and then I'll focus on the last one. So first of all, to say, as Will mentioned, the case studies we feature in the presentation and in the guide are taken from published reports. So there is a lot more information available. We provide an interpretation of the methods in the context of the use of SEEA EEA, but there is more available. Then on the e-learning, I use 50 slides that you will receive soon. We have more than 200 in the full slide deck. And if you're interested, a connected topic and also an e-learning opportunity offered by UNEP and UNITAR is the Green Economy online course, which also has a specific module on modeling the green economy, which is less oriented to the environment per se. It's more oriented towards economic and social dynamics. But I would think is a very nice complement if you're interested in expanding your analysis from the accounts into that level of policy analysis. Now, in terms of policymakers that I've been working with, my experience goes beyond the accounts. I started working on poverty reduction strategies 20 years ago. Then I expanded my work in linking the economy with the environment and the environment back to the economy, including energy dynamics, of course. And I've worked primarily on green economy, green growth, climate mitigation, and adaptation. So I come in anytime there is a need for a systemic analysis and when there is a need for creating new models, updated models. So in my experience, I've worked with a variety of decision makers, going from ministries of finance to ministries of environment, with topics related to macroeconomic planning to specific infrastructure investment. The main challenges I've been facing in my work is that when I deal with a multitude of stakeholders, so when we have a multi-stakeholder working group, all the participants speak different professional languages. And so the most important challenge is to align, harmonize the key topics and key results to make sure that everyone finds something useful for their own specific work. So it's not the quality of the model itself, the type of message that comes out, but it's really making sure that everyone is on the same page and aligned in terms of what the modeling work says. There is a lot of room for misinterpretation of results. That is the main challenge I've faced over time. Then overall, we need to keep in mind that beyond the science and the technical work that we do, there is a policy dimension. So there may be stakeholders that have already preconceived solutions to the policy problem. And so this is where we need to take them by the hand and explain why the model works the way it does. Again, it's not enough to just publish the report. So what I've seen is that normally those stakeholders that become involved in the process at the very end of such process are the ones that tend to be facing the most challenges in using the results. But what is critical, and for that I would stimulate you to take this extra step, is that the modeling work is only successful if we have local champions. If you have someone that passes the message forward and that reaches out to other researchers, to other ministries and departments, to make sure that there is more of a broad acceptance and support for the analysis performed, rather than an isolated effort. And I think this is the power of the SEEA EEA. You have data being provided that can support simultaneously 5-10 different policy processes at the country level that may go on at the same time. So it's an excellent opportunity to have impact from a systemic point of view. Over to you, Will.
Thanks. We're coming to a close, but we just have some background noise just the last few minutes. I'm not able to mute people from here, so perhaps... Okay. Okay, I think we have, at least as I see in the chat, we have one last question, and then we can, I think, wrap up, but of course there'll be plenty of opportunity later to come back with further discussions. So Dr. Eugene Itwa is asking, how do we use the model to identify legal gaps vis-a-vis needed elements actions for developing a national plan for advancing environmental economic accounting and complete integration of natural capital accounting into the development plans? So yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry, that's a tough one. Yeah, we'll leave you with the easy one, Andrea.
My experience on this is that when you run scenarios that you think will lead to positive outcomes, but side effects emerge from the model, that is highlighting that you need more legal inputs to make so that new complementary policies can be designed to maintain the positive outcomes, but avoid the emergence of the side effects and the negative outcomes. So in a way, we need to trust the model in its capacity to generate forecasts that are realistic, in saying any side effect requires extra regulation. It doesn't have to be a mandate. It could be an incentive. It could be any additional intervention that stimulates the right type of behavior so that you can maintain the positive outcomes and avoid the negative ones. So I would say it's something that emerges from the process of developing a model. And the more systemic and integrated the model is, the more these side effects can be identified.
Thanks. And yeah, just someone is asking if you could share a link to the green economy modeling course. Perhaps that can be in the resources provided. Yeah, we can do that. So I think, colleagues, we are about at time. And as I said, a lot of complimentary comments and gratitude are coming through the chat. So just to relay those to you, Andrea, I think it's been a very well received session. And, you know, from our side, thank you very much for sharing your experience. And, yeah, thank you to everyone for the thought-provoking and challenging questions. And with that, I think I'll pass to Peter, if you'd like to officially close us for today.
Thank you so much, William, for moderating this session. I'm so excited and happy that it has been very interactive. Thank you, Professor Andrea. I think everyone is satisfied with all the answers that you've provided to them. And I want to inform all the participants that what Andrea has been providing, we'll find a way to share them with you after the final presentation is done, with some links to all the documentations that you're requesting to be shared with you. And I want to encourage you all to visit the website for the community of practice. We'll be sharing information, and if some of the respective countries and institutions have information that they want to all participants and the community members to get to know about them and participate, please contact us and we will be able to share all this information. Thank you so much, UNEP. Thank you so much, all participants. See you in the next month for another webinar series that will inform you on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.